Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In case anybody has wanted to check, we are here for the insurance discussion. Just making sure you weren't here for liturgical dance or any of the other active discussions that are going on. So welcome to those on the bridge, but either those by audio or by the web. This session is to talk about our insurance program and a number of elements. Oops, let me first make sure I can change slides. There we go. I just want to remind everyone that this session is, after me saying that, I didn't record it. Let me remind everyone that this session is being recorded. It'll be available on the web for those that couldn't make it today, or if you'd like to go back and follow up on anything. So a number of areas we're going to touch. Actually, Mark, could you? Yeah, thanks. We're going to touch information on the Diocesan insurance program. We're going to update how premiums are calculated and distributed across parishes, churches, because that is changing. We're going to do a quick touch on third-party coverage, and because that always seems to generate a bunch of questions. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So one thinks of insurance, but I like to just start out with what we're really doing with this is risk management. And each of you that is a warden in a church, each of you that's a long-standing member, risk management is a term that you might not necessarily use for what you do, but it is something you do every day. So when you walk into the church and you realize there's ice on the sidewalk and you throw some salt on it, that's risk management. When you look at a set of stairs and go, there's no railing, and you say that needs to be fixed, that's risk management. So all of those things are part of, from the business processes of the church. That always sounds funny, but that can be things like collection plates. What happens to the money Sunday morning after the plate is blessed at the front? Where does it go? Who has access to it? Where might that end up? Where is the holy hardware left secured? Is the church locked? Is our bank account secure? So there's 100 things that are risk management. Insurance is really the last step. Insurance is for when things go wrong. So think of it that way, that what you're really doing is starting out as, what are the risks, what are the things that could happen in our church, in our facility, to our people that we need to be looking at. And we're going to expand that, hopefully, as the year goes, to talk more about risk management, of which insurance is one component. Insurance is required under the canons. Canon 41 prescribes that all property and all churches must be insured, both from the property perspective and also for liability. And that liability is for the clergy. That liability is for the officers, so the wardens and other appointed roles. It's for those that attend the church. It's for those members of the vestry, those that might be in the building and in any other way, employees, volunteers, etc. It also, in our context, covers, unfortunately, the eventuality that there is misconduct, which is typically, in our history, has been of a sexual nature. The plan is administered by the diocese, and the churches are responsible for the premiums. If you look back, the diocese did not have insurance until 1975, interestingly enough. Prior to that, individual churches had individual policies. And some churches had fire insurance, others had some liability insurance for slip and fall. Many didn't have coverage beyond that. I raise this because we, in fact, have dealt with a couple of matters where the occurrence happened before the diocese had insurance. And we've actually dealt with several old issues, old being many decades, that we are still legally liable and responsible for, both at the church and at the diocesan level. But that was first put in place in 1975. We're now part of a national program. I actually sit on the committee for this at the national level, where we go out and actually Aon as our broker. And this last year the year before in 2018, for the 2019 coverage, we actually went what they call back to market. And they invited 35 different insurers to bid for the insurance coverage for us. 11 expressed interest, but only 3 actually agreed that they would cover the whole dimension. So property and liability and all the different elements of it. And the decision based on the pricing and the service, the decision was to remain with our current insurer and our current broker. But we do every 4 to 5 years take this back to market to ensure we're getting the best price possible. I'm not going to read the chart, but Aon is a large global company, about 10 billion of revenue. They cover a wide range of things for risk, and they do employee solutions, health solutions, but they also act as what we know of as a broker. While they're headquartered out of the UK, we are served by the Ottawa office. The national program served out of Toronto. The Ottawa office serves this diocese. Meanwhile, our account executive has just at Christmas time left. For those that dealt with Russell Uliat, Russell has left Aon, and right now we're working with the manager for the region until they get somebody in to replace him. The bulk of our coverage actually comes from ecclesiastical. If ecclesiastical sounds like a church word, it is. It was back in the 1880s when there was issues in England, and a number of churchmen and some of the so-called statesmen came together to start to provide insurance for the Church of England. It's actually gone on to be owned by something called All Churches Trust. And All Churches Trust is a large registered charity, not-for-profit. So whatever ecclesiastical ends up making ends up donated back out to a number of charities. They're a large multi-billion-dollar with group assets. They're based out of the UK. They specialize in religious organizations. And hence they have an appetite for the things that we need to cover the things that as a church and our individual churches for that coverage. So we use them. Their office here we use out of Toronto. Those that were at Synod last year would have seen ecclesiastical on the bags, because they supported our Synod through that. So the ecclesiastical has the bulk of our coverage. So just a quick update on the insurance as we approached 2020. In general, they're telling us that the Canadian insurance market has been stable. There is capacity, so there is people out there taking on risk, but the markets have become very selective about what they underwrite because there's increasing amount of exposure. So they're both in terms of what what they will underwrite and how much they will willing to underwrite becomes a factor. And of course, we all know that in the last number of years, there's been some very large, North American and globally, there's been some large weather-related, climate-related, things like fires and earthquakes and floods that have all caused major outlays for the insurance companies, and that affects us all. A little bit of fine print, but just to talk for a moment about the specifics of the Anglican Church, because there really are a limited number of companies that will take on the risk that churches bring. So part of it is that it is viewed as in the market as high risk. Part of it is because their appetite for the type of exposure on sexual abuse that is not significant. And the other end of that is that most of the coverage is done on what's called a most of the coverage is done on an occurrence basis. So that means that things that happened 20 years ago, the company that had the coverage then is responsible. There's also something called as reported coverage, which means that it gets reported now, it happened 30 years ago, and today's insurance company is responsible. That's uncommon to get on a company that will underwrite that. But from a church perspective, you are taking on what's referred to as a long tail. You're taking on things that happened, that happened in the 1970s, but are only reported now. And that company is still responsible. So there's a reluctance there. Property insurance, again, buildings. Churches tend to have a high degree of vacancy. There's a lot of time when there's nobody in the building. There's a lot of time when it necessarily isn't being entirely supervised, particularly in a rural environment. A lot of the churches have building that practices that were several hundred years old. So there's wood frame churches, stone churches that may now have structural issues. There's a lot of pieces around that they again leads them to say not our preferred course to insure. And then finally they're vulnerable because of the age, because in a rural context, fire coverage. So those that deal with your own home insurance, it asks you, how close are you to a fire hydrant? Oh, about 30 kilometers. How close are you to a fire hall? Because that basically says how long from the time the fire department responds until they're able to start dealing with it. So that coverage, again, they are nervous about coverage in rural areas. And they also recognize that in a lot of cases, churches aren't always well kept in terms of maintenance, that things can slip because of just the nature of money, the nature of people looking after it. So again, they categorize that across the board, there is some level of risk. So the program that we are part of is a broad program. It covers property, it covers liability, it covers abuse, and it covers the range of things that go on within our property and within our liability. Boilers. So some churches have boilers. Some places have multiple boilers. Some of our churches have furnaces. Some of our churches have baseboard heaters. Some of our churches don't have any heating. They still have the duct work, but it's not used anymore. General liability, miscellaneous liability, crime. So someone steals from the church, coverage there. Directors and officers liability. So wardens are considered a director or an officer. So when you sign on to be a warden, that's always something we're very thankful for. You actually, in the canons, sign up to be part of the corporation. The two wardens together form the corporation. That makes you legally responsible. So there is a directors and officers insurance that covers that. So on the property side, we cover fire, storm damage, so wind, rain, lightning, floods. We've had probably the most common claim in my time in the office is floods. We've had a lot of church basements flooded. Pollution, that can be things like an oil tank or a car in the parking lot that loses a gas tank. All of those things. Vandalism, again, there's unfortunately occasions where churches are victims of vandalism, and also for theft, whether that's being broken into or whether that's fraud or negligence, but it can happen in a number of ways. Just an important note, property coverage is based on replacement cost. If you look at your policy, that it is based upon replacement cost. It's broken in two. It's broken down to the building and to your contents. And some of those are quite historic. And you need to be looking at them to ensure that that is the correct amount that replacement costs would reflect on both the contents and on the building itself. So they use, and so that's both sides of it. On one side, they calculate your premium based on replacement cost, but of course, on the other hand, all you're insured for. So if you went to replace your building and it cost $10 million, and you only had $5 million of insurance, that's all you get. So there's an important balance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, around what is your insured replacement cost and what is the insured cost on the contents. Contents is the insides of the building, but would include, the furniture, would include office equipment. If in the case of churches that have organs, the organ is considered contents, not property. So in many cases, there is not significant coverage on contents. So this year, when we'll talk about it, you will get what your levels are, and you need to take a look at those to ensure that they are adequate. There's limits by peril. So there's a limit on how much the liability is for example, $2 million for director's insurance. And so each of the perils has a limit, and that too is on the document that you'll receive. And finally, there's deductibles. And those deductibles range in different levels. So for example, on a flood, it's $25,000. On many other things, it's $2,500. So again, each of them is listed out in the document you'll receive this year with your insurance invoice. We'll talk a bit about that, but there's some numbers that just kind of show you the type of data that's there. Don't often get asked, but are we covered for earthquake? Yes, we are. As you can see, flood damage, $25,000, sewer backups, $10,000. There's a number of them that break through. General liability is there to protect the organization and its agents. That's the wardens, that's the volunteers, that's the staff. It's basically everyone that's part of that organization against civil liability, for bodily injury, property damage, or personal injury. Typical things here. So someone slips on the front steps of the church and falls. Then there is coverage for that liability. If someone is touched inappropriately, there is coverage for that liability. But those things pertain to the church and those that are directly involved in it. We'll come back to third party a little later. But it does, for clarity, it protects your wardens and treasurers. It protects staff. It also protects the volunteers. So your Sunday school teachers, the people that are doing pastoral ministry, etc., are covered for their actions on the organization's behalf. I mentioned about wardens and treasurers, so that directors and officers. And that basically protects in the event that something occurs and there's a legal action. I can guarantee you that if there's a lawsuit filed against your church for misconduct, the wardens will be personally named in that suit. That's a simple statement of how this works. And so the settlement for that covers not only the church, but there's separate coverage for wardens based on things you do, things you don't do, and they're all listed there. Of course, all this is interesting, but it starts to get to what happens with the money. So we negotiated a package on property where we have a rate freeze for a number of years. So this year, the rate on boiler and property will go up by 0. The property values, depending on where, and we're all in the same zone, go up by inflation. So the replacement cost goes up. So they calculate your premium based on replacement cost times the rate. The rate doesn't change, but every year the property value goes up by inflation. This year it went up 2% roughly. However, on some of the liability side, we have seen some significant changes. Commercial and general liabilities up 8.73%. The directors and officers liabilities up 25%. Crime is up 25%, and abuse is up 73%. And I'll walk you through what that ends up meaning in a moment. Based upon what's been going on, not just in our case, but across the piece for ecclesiastical. In the midst of that, I also want to mention that ecclesiastical has provided us with a couple of potential credits. And these are a little bit specific and only pertain to property, not to liability. But there are two ways, one for roofing, where if you've put a complete new roof on, and then or you get an inspection done that confirms that it's in good shape, then there's a 5% credit on property. Similarly for plumbing, and this is not so much the supply side, this is more the drainage and sewer side, but it basically says that a visual inspection's scoping's been done of the drains and sewer lines, and that anything that needed attention's been taken care of. Of course, the reason that they're providing those credits is to encourage you to take care of your drains, take care of your roofs, and that will help eliminate claims. But there is a one-time 5% rebate. You can contact us if you want to pursue that. So we also have a couple of things that are local to the diocese. So I mentioned deductibles, and $2,500 for a lot of things, $25,000 for several. And $25,000 is a reasonably significant amount, particularly for the smaller churches. It is for any church these days. So the diocese has historically had a deductible reduction program. Always have to be careful how you say that. A deductible reduction program. And that program basically takes the deductible and reduces it by 80%. So a $25,000 deductible ends up being a $5,000 deductible. A $2,500 deductible ends up being $500. What we do is we have a reserve fund at the diocese that we use to pay for that as they go through the year. At the end of the year, we look at how do we top it up. That gets pushed into the premium fund and dispersed back out. So you pay for it, but you pay for it all the churches together based upon how it's had to be used. The second thing that's traditionally been there, and I don't think this was well understood either, there's been a payment plan. And that payment plan for churches looked like you get 6 months of interest free in order to pay for your premium. Well, that's true to a point. However, what happened is that what the Aon provides the diocese was with 6-month financing, and then the cost of that interest got put into the premium pool and spread out to churches. So it's a little bit like when you hear Leon saying, no money down, no interest. You're paying for it, you're just paying for it in the price. So again, what we've done is recognize that was there and was not well understood, and to be honest, wasn't completely transparent. So as we get into a little bit of the detail, Aon calculates your church's premium with the appraised cost times the rate. That gets to the property number. But liability is exactly the same for every church in the diocese. It does not matter if you're the largest church or if you're the smallest church. If you have 2 people coming on Sunday or 200, whether you have 1,000 people on your list or you have 5 people on your list, whether your budget is $10 or $10 million, we get charged the same amount for liability. Here's what liability premium actually looks like. For 2019, it was $736.20. That is the same for every church. Matters not on size, budget, risk, anything. It is the same. That's going to go up this year to, as we indicated earlier, I walked you through the rates, how they are moving. It's going to go up this year by about $230. And that's the same for every single church. It also, and I will put this note out there, and we're going to be following up on these, we've got a number of cases where we are now selling churches. The church has been deconsecrated and sold, but there's still a cemetery associated with that old church. And the cemetery has a board that continues as part of the parish or part of the region. The cemetery's been living off the insurance of the church. And once we sell the church, the insurance goes away. So one of the things now is for those that have cemeteries that are no longer, that cemetery is no longer part of a church. For example, St. Luke's Lyndhurst, which was, when we sell Camp Hyanto, St. Luke's has been deconsecrated. It's now back in the diocesan hand. The cemetery is still insured. But when we sell and we stop the insurance, now the cemetery board will have to have their own insurance. And that's, again, because we're selling churches. That's something that we need to make sure at the cemetery level we work our way through. But it's an important thing to note here. If your bill in 2019 was less than $750, then you're a major part of what's coming next. So the way that the insurance premiums were distributed was that we get a bill from Aon, and that bill is around $250,000, and it covers all the churches of the diocese. So that got put into a pot. The deductible reduction, the top-up of that from the previous year, also gets added into that pot. The interest also gets added to that pot. And then the practice was, because in the previous days, the way that Aon broke things out, it was difficult. That got spread out to churches based upon their percentage or their proportion of the total diocesan replacement cost. So it was not based on their actual premium. It was based upon how much their replacement cost of their property was as a percentage of how much the diocese was. So you can imagine there's some churches that are very small, that the building is worth very little. There was some very small insurance bills out there, right? There are others on the large church side that represent more above average, and they're paying a greater share. So some of these are minor, some of these are more significant. So what we've ended up with is our higher value church, or higher value buildings and contents bearing a disproportionately high cost of the premium, share of the premium. The low value buildings and contents have borne a lower cost. And that's for the most part because of liability. Because that liability, of course, is the same for every single church. It ends up causing ourselves poor stewardship because in some cases we're providing a false economy. And again, what we're doing is in some cases not making decisions and not looking at the total cost of keeping some buildings open. And we have some churches that that are not even worshipped in once a year that remain within parishes because the church has decided not to deal with it, because we know that's a hard thing to do. And so that's one issue, but the broader issue is the insurance for that church, which is probably over $1,000, ends up being billed less than $100. And the other churches are picking that up. So that's become an issue, and finally, that's an issue just for lack of transparency. It's not that I'm sure anyone doesn't say we want to balance, we want to support, we want to do all the things we do as a diocese, but we need to do those things consciously, and we need to be aware and visible that they're happening. So, as I mentioned earlier, we had previously used the financing and payment through Aon, and then basically put it into your accounts, typically in April or so, and then given 6 months of interest-free to pay it. For 2020, what Synod Council has approved is we're not going to charge any interest into the pool, right? You can now, the diocese will pay the bill. We'll actually save interest because our operating line, we can get it cheaper than Aon was charging us. And then each church can then decide, rather than everybody being billed an amount of insurance that you don't know about, it'll go into your account and you can choose when you pay it. It'll garner insurance, but you'll garner interest, but you can choose whether to spread it out and now pay that knowing what you're paying. Others can choose to pay it early on, but you'll now know what it's being costing you. It's not going to cost any more. In fact, it should net to the diocese cost less to all the churches together. But that'll be now put into your account, and basically rather than paying 6, it'll be 4. So council passed that really on 3 pieces. One is that we continue the deductible reduction program. So we reviewed that in detail, and it was felt there was significant value. And the other piece is that we've discontinued the 6-month free program. And then finally, that we will actually charge the amount of insurance that a parish is due. So you will now get a statement that says from Aon, this is the premium for your church. Here's the property, here's the liability. It's all broken down in detail. We'll talk more about that in a moment, how it gets constructed, but what it is going to do is cause some changes. So what we've looked at doing, similar to when the clergy benefits changed a number of years ago, if a church's increase of premium for 2020 over 2019, because of the calculation change, if it's more than $500, then the church will qualify for a subsidy. And the subsidy will be 50% of the increase. And I can tell you the largest increase is about $1,000 based on the modeling. So it'll cover half the increase, pretty much up to $500. The subsidization funds are going to come from the 10 churches that benefit the most. And so we have several of those that go as high as $1,500 that they're going to see in reductions. And they're going to contribute a quarter of that for 2020. And that's going to help us balance it out for the small churches, while the larger churches or larger bills will still see a significant reduction. And then council will review it again in the fall of 2020 for 2021 program. So what you'll get is a bill that has the actual Aon certificate and invoice. It'll have HST and fee attached to it. It'll have the deductible deduction program. I can let you know now that Candace has done the work, and the amount is small enough that we're not going to top it up this year. So that amount will be 0 for 2020. And then the subsidization, which will either be a charge or a credit. Target for us is to get those billings out the end of February, so they're in your, the invoices out, and have them into the parish accounts for the end of February. Recommend that wardens take a look at the coverage and start thinking about, is the coverage adequate? There is also an option, I will add. We have some churches, and this is again because of the nature that they're very specific on how we can manage things. There are churches that are insured for a few $1 million, and the reality is that we would never rebuild that multi-million-dollar church for 50 people. You would do something different. Unfortunately, Aon does not allow you to say, don't insure me for $2 million, insure me for $500. Unless you go and get a set of plans and an engineer, an architect, engineer, and contract estimates. We're looking at trying to be able to do that on a global basis, but basically there's no way back through that. The exception is, I'm not sure, this is just out there, we do this with disused properties. You can insure for what's called demolition value. And that basically says if a fire happened, They will pay to demolish and then basically grade and rehab the lot. We recommend you take a look at your coverage, start looking again at risk management around your buildings. Cemeteries that no longer have a building require coverage separately. And as I mentioned, council will review this again at the end of 2020. Just a quick touch on third party. So one of the common questions we get is, is the church covered? Yes. Are our people covered? Yes. If our youth group goes on a field trip, goes bowling, are they covered? Yes. Are they covered in the car while they're driving? Well, the insurance company, your drivers and your car insurance and the church's liability insurance will get into a conversation. But yes, there is coverage. Those are all. If the parish has a congregational picnic at a campground or a public park, are we covered? Yes. You need it, and that's will come back to a certificate. Many will ask for that. You get other questions like, are we covered if we have a dinner? Yes. The one exception, by the way, and if you serve wine at that dinner, are you covered? Well, that depends. If that wine is not, if any alcohol is not, if you're not charging for it, then you're covered. But if a church event, a parish event, has alcohol being sold, and that's typically considered to be a cash bar versus more than a wine with your dinner, then you require third-party insurance because that's not covered. They do not cover a cash bar at a parish event.
Who would offer the third-party insurance?
Hub. Hub has a package for that.
Oh, okay. So either. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
If you're charging $20 a plate and that includes a glass of wine.
If the question was if you're charging $20 a plate and it includes a glass of wine, you're okay. If you're then saying at the bar you can go back and buy a bottle for $40 or you can buy a second glass, but that's the line is when it's a cash bar. That's the question.
So even though you're serving wine at a dinner and it's your own church people serving the wine, you still would require third-party insurance?
If you've got cash bar, that's correct. If you're just offering if you're offering a glass of wine, right, then you're okay. If you're selling by the glass, then you require separate insurance.
That's good to know.
And that's something that as we work our way through, I'm highlighting this year because it wasn't clear to me.
No,
So I'm assuming it isn't clear to most of you either. But third-party groups, when they come in to rent your hall, one of the common mysteries out there, well, AA has global insurance. AA does not have any insurance. Now, what Hub does is they have a low cost for AA groups. But there's always been this mystique that AA has some kind of global insurance. The truth of that is they do not. And if there's an easy way to get at that. By the way, it does not require, as a church, you can make the decision to pay the insurance for a group. Like for AA, you could make the decision that says we will support that group and that the church will pay for the insurance. But there still needs to be third-party insurance. Anyone who is using your hall that is not a church event. So let me give you the other one that I often get asked. So, it's my birthday. And the church is going to throw me a birthday party in the hall. Are we covered? So the question is it a parish event? Well, yes, the wardens have organized it, the priest, then we are covered. If my family, on the other hand, says, we want to throw him a birthday party, we don't want his side of the family stinking up our house, so we're going to rent the church hall. And they're renting it for a function. Even though I'm a member of the church, that's not a church event. So if it is a parish event, if you as wardens are signing that this is a church event, this is part of our ministry, this would go into our annual report, that kind of thing, then it is a church event. If it's an outside party, then they require third-party insurance.
So would we as a church provide that third-party insurance, or would the people renting the home?
Normally what would happen is you will say, if you don't have insurance, and some groups do,
Well, I think like a family rents the home for Christmas.
the family
Eve.
does it, then you can give them the forms, and some churches, they say, here, you need to go and get this. Other times, the church will help them with it. But as long as the form gets filled out and the money gets paid,
For the third party.
that really is all that matters.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
But it is that group taking out insurance, not the church, just for clarity.
Right.
It's not the church taking it out. So that means any third-party group, not part of your church's ministry, if it doesn't fit in your annual report, then it probably is not your thing. And the forms are on the website, the contact is there. We changed this year to Hub, but the coverage is pretty much the same, and they can provide that as you go. Don?
I had 2 people for January, and the list that got sent out for the rate was not correct. So when I contacted
Rob Fournier, yep.
he sent me the correct one, and I asked him to send that to you.
Which
as
he did,
well.
with a million apologies, because and so they did not send the complete list piece. And to be honest, what happened is he moved over, and they didn't completely package that thing out. But it is correct on the website now, right, Mark? It is. So the forms are now correct. And thank you for catching that.
Yeah.
So a couple of other just quick questions, and then we'll go to general questions. Certificate of insurance. When would you request one? Well, as I mentioned, if any group is using your facility, they need to have a certificate of insurance. It could be they as a group have their own, right? They can then request their insurance company to provide it. So if you're using somebody else's facilities, if you're taking your parish picnic to a city park, if you're taking your youth group they may ask you for a certificate of insurance to demonstrate that you have liability coverage. And so when you're using outside facilities, you can then request that. Again, there's a form to do that, that goes back into, Aon.
Alex, sorry, can I just clarify that? That was another one I need, but we take our VBS group on a field trip every year.
Uh-huh.
This year, I think we're gonna go to the pump house in Kingston. So would we carry that certificate of insurance from our church?
If-
When we go to the pump house with those kids, or?
Yeah, they would be insured under that if the pump house asks for it, because some places will ask for it. Some places will ask for it when you rent it. Other cases, if you go to Canada's Wonderland, they're not gonna ask you for a certificate of, but,
Yes.
but there are places when you use them will ask for a
So it would be
certificate.
advisable to carry it with you?
It's not a bad thing, nope, not a bad thing.
Okay.
Deductibles, always a question. Always when there's a claim. It's never something ahead of time. People don't sit and go over coffee. By the way, how much? So deductibles, they're listed by peril on the document you'll receive with your invoice. The other one we get into is, why might a claim be denied? So there's a number of reasons for it. One is that if it doesn't exceed the deductible, the insurer goes, the deductible's $25,000 and it's a $10,000 claim. Sorry, we deny it. Second thing is, it's not covered under the policy. There are pieces of things that are not covered under the policies that not common, but there can be things that aren't, plain and simple, aren't covered. And then finally, and this is the biggest one, we've had a couple of cases where there's been storm damage. There's been roof leak, windstorm and roof. And in several cases, the adjusters have gone in and with engineers have said, sorry, that roof was not properly maintained, or that roof was not properly designed and built. So what will happen is they will cover other pieces. In one case, the church was covered. They said that damage to the roof on the south side is covered, but on this side, those shingles were not kept in good repair, and there was no moisture barrier, and they then say that they don't cover that. So maintenance and or neglected maintenance and base condition do make a difference, because they look at it and say, that kind of weather, the roof's there to protect, the shingles are on the roof to protect that. And if the shingles can't protect because they're not maintained, then there's an issue. That's always a difficult conversation. Always. And the adjuster is straight and center with that. So,
A question for you on that last.
sure.
On the adjuster, we had an occasion where during a heavy windstorm, some shingles were blown off. We decided that it would be due diligence to replace those shingles before rain then entered the building. I'm not sure we were denied, or maybe there was a question brought up, but somebody said we should have had the adjuster look at the damage before we fixed it.
In most cases, that is the preferred path. The adjuster can be there with some cases within hours.
Well, this is over Christmas.
Right, but that, it generally, it gets fuzzy in terms of what you need to do. You have a responsibility to mitigate damage,
Exactly, yeah.
right? And they will recognize that, but I would not say, well, it's Christmas, I'm gonna wait till Jan the 3rd to report it and have it redone, because that will get into a fuzzy zone with the insurance company. And I just find when you're dealing with insurance companies, my personal view is try and avoid fuzziness, because they, by definition, now we find that Aon's pretty good, but again, you get into the insurance company looking at the claim, the adjuster locally representing it, and trying to balance through. So other questions? Donna?
How do we go about then, so if our church is like 2 minutes from a fire hall, or the structure is excellent, to get someone to come and look at it and say, this church is in good standing, or is the amount right,
Well, looking at the amounts is been a difficult one, and I see that Doug Noyles is on the line from St. John's Bath, and Doug's gone through a bit of an exercise with ecclesiastical around a reappraisal. And in the old days, they would send out an appraiser, and they don't do that as much as they used to, particularly to rural areas. They tend now to put you through a web-based appraisal tool, and that kind of lets you work that through. I would say the first real level of that is, if you look at what your insured values are and see, does that at all sound reasonable? And there are some cases that I would say probably it isn't. And in which case it's then a matter of saying, then we need to go through the process to get a reappraisal done. Recognizing it increases premium. That's the issue. But no, and then the other factors, again, if your roof, they assume that your roof is in reasonable shape. That's kind of the assumption. And then if it's not, then when you get time for a claim, that's when you get into issues.
The other question I had was around liability, because it costs so much, but all the work that everyone does with Safe Church, getting your police checks and making sure it's always 2 people, and
Yep.
windows in the doors and all this stuff
Yep.
none of that.
It does count. I think the question for those on the bridge was all the work that is put in, the investment in things like Safe Church and doing police checks and all this, things we do with security in churches, and that does count in that sense. They do their liability on a pool basis, and unfortunately, even where there are programs in place, we do get, for example, evil in. Unfortunately, some of these insurance companies they look at our history that happened 40 years ago. Unfortunately, in this diocese, we're dealing with things that happened 40 plus years ago. That's still very clearly their appetite for risk. So, yep, I would say that unfortunately, if we weren't doing those things, our rates would be even higher.
Okay.
Even higher. Questions on the bridge? You can either ask them via audio, or you can pop a chat message up.
I have another question. When it comes to a cemetery that's attached to an active church,
Yep.
does our insurance cover if vandalism happened and stones were knocked over to get all that fixed?
So
Well,
the
that's happening all around us, more in the States, I guess.
so the question was on cemetery stones. And generally the insurers are going to look for stones with vandalism. Your own, if your family stone is there, they will typically turn first to your house insurance to cover because you technically own that stone. So they will cover the cemetery damage. They will often cover. That's why sometimes you see the stones get laid down and put in place, because that's kind of the minimum level. If you want the stone, which is your family had purchased and stood up there, then you are typically looking at your own insurance or your own cost. Nope.
Follow up on that though, a lot of these cemeteries have old stones.
Yeah.
Yep.
Families are no longer around or can't be traced. Who's responsible then?
Well, then the cemetery ends up trying to maintain their cemetery, right? You got care and maintenance funds. And unfortunately now when you do care and maintenance, you put money in that covers some of that stone, that kind of protection. But for stones that were put in 60 years ago or 80 years ago or 100 years ago, that's one that typically the cemetery board will try and struggle with. Again, that's why I think in a lot of cases you see a stone laid down flat over the grave rather than built back up, because it's not stable. But yeah, that is, you can't get money where there isn't any. I was going to say you can't get blood from a stone, but that's a bad pun in this case.
Again, I just want to be clear around roofs. So my church has a stone and tar roof.
Mm-hmm.
It has leaked the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of damage, we mop it up. Now we're thinking of putting on a steel roof.
Right?
I can get a rebate for that?
You can get a 5% for 1 year. The year you put that in, you can go and apply for a 5% rebate on your property insurance.
On the insurance.
Property insurance.
Property insurance.
Right. Yep. If you put a new roof on your church and other question? Anybody else on the bridge have any questions?
Alex, this is Doug. Can you hear me?
I can. We can.
Okay, my question or my question concerns third-party insurance. In particular, the existing process today. I call it a black hole. It's the missing link in the process. It's the return confirmation from PBL or HUB that our application has been approved. Right now, I said it's a black hole. We may get a canceled check that meaning that they accepted it, but no real proof that the insurance application has been approved, whether it's an email with a reference number, a certificate, the actual certificate, or that the event has been added to the policy. It's a missing link, and I always have to keep chasing it down. It would be nice if you, the diocese, would ask that Robert add that to his process.
I can indeed. I wasn't aware of that, Doug. I mean, that's one that certainly we don't. I mean, for clarity, the diocese does this just as a convenience for our churches. You don't have to use HUB. By the way, there are other companies out there that do this. We've set up HUB simply as a convenience. There's a number of churches that have chosen to use other. You can't do that for core insurance, but for third party. But Doug, I will go back to and make the point with him, because at the end of the day, insurance is a great deal of it is service, and I can understand the church might not get it, but I would expect that the group that's applied for it should have.
And there's been one client of ours who's specifically asked for it, and I could never get it for them.
Okay, well, I will add that to my list of things to to follow up on, and we'll go chase for that.
I had two.
Thank you.
Didn't get, okay, because again, we do this on an annualized basis, so when we review this in the fall, if the answers we're not getting service, then we'll change companies.
I had that trouble with PBL, I haven't had it with Hub.
I had two just in January and didn't get no response. I scanned the application, didn't say, yep, okay, got it. No
Yep.
good."
Okay, no, I will go back and, because that, again, you know, the group is paying for service. Thanks, Doug.
I will say that when we had our major flood, our insurance company called Ottawa right away. They sent out the adjuster right away. They got, because there was so much flooding in our area.
Yeah.
All the contractors were busy. They sent a beef out from Ottawa. Like
Yep.
we were just on the ball to get that water out of it.
They have generally, I find, and they use, you know, contractors like First Response and First On Site, people like that mitigate. That I agree. They do very much focus at that and provide quick turn with that. I had a question from the web. How does a parish discern that it's at the bulldozer insurance level? You know, what's a sort of a checkpoint to that? And I guess part of that, one of the difficult things for us is realizing as ministry starts to come to end in a place, and the archdeacons see it, the bishop and I do, as you're working through, there's a small group of people left. You know, we have a church that made a decision last summer to close at Christmas. You know, there was like 6 people at the vestry meeting that made that decision. There was an average of 2 people coming to church on a Sunday. And what happens is that they're financially, you know, just not viable to continue to be serviced by a priest. And so there was a number of things that happened. But I think the real question that wardens and working with the clergy need to ask is, you know, what are we paying for with insurance? And what are we going to do if there was a loss of the building? What would we do? Would we rebuild this place? And let's be honest, a great number of our churches, right, we would ultimately come to a conclusion of doing something different. Because again, we have, let's be frank, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, we have more buildings than capacity than we as a churches of the diocese need. I'm not aware of too many of our churches that are overcrowded on a Sunday.
Wouldn't that be lovely? Yeah.
So one of the questions is, you know, sometimes God sends a message in a different way, and then there's an opportunity. I'll also add that there's opportunities come out of these things. Bob Wright up at Marmora, they had a flood in their basement, and they decided that this was the latest flood in their basement, and rather than continuing to have their hall in the basement, they decided to use the money along and then fundraised and got some grants and did some things, and they redid the rest of their building and put the hall at main level. That makes it accessible, turns it into a community resource, and now they've had a whole different path, and then now the basement is just used for storage. And that too is a valid thing, that sometimes, you know, good comes out of a difficult situation. But it really is a case of sitting down as wardens with the clergy and really talking through, is this the right stewardship of this church's money? I mean, I'm aware of a couple of cases now where there's the collection, you know, the annual income is about $5,000. Now, how are you going to, you know, the insurance, the liability alone's $1,000. It starts to come, and that's some of the work that we have to do as dioceses, as churches, as regions, as we work these things through. But it's not a very comfortable or happy discussion, but it's one we need to have as stewards. I have 2:59 and my commitment was an hour. Have any other questions? Last call to the bridge.
Actually, there is one.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, was there someone that wants to speak on that? Sorry.
What was, Somebody on the bridge have a question?
Yes, I do. It's Doug again. This
Okay.
time it's on to the property and liability.
Yes.
You mentioned February statements. Mid-March, we'll see these the new build-up. Would we also be receiving our actual certificate for 2020 at that date?
That's the intention, yes.
Okay,
We don't
that's
have,
good to do because many grant applications require us to include that certificate,
yep. We
and
don't,
they usually have to be completed by the end of March.
as I mentioned, our exec there has changed out. We don't have them yet, but I expect to have them in the coming weeks.
Super, and coverage is January 1 to December 31st as before?
December 31st to December 31st, yes.
Excellent, thank you.
We are bound. Sorry, one other question here in the room?
Sorry, Alex. It actually doesn't pertain to other churches, but for ours in particular. How relative is it to have a proper operating fire alarm system in the church relative to the actual fire insurance that we would have to claim if anything ever happened to our church?
Again, the insurer assumes that that's spotty. The fire department may have a different opinion, right? Your local fire code, based on size, occupancy, etc. This building, we by code have to have fire detection. There has to be alarms and systems. So it's less the insurer and more the insurer kind of really assumes the worst.
Well, the company who maintains the fire alarm system for us has basically told us that our system is not adequate right now.
Yep.
So, and we've sort of, we've delayed the process for, by putting a period of time that we do. We've been trying to,
Yep.
to get it. And I guess the concern I have is that in the event that our church happens to catch on fire one day and they can say the fire alarm system was inadequate, what happens? Like it's quite a concern. Like it has been, Judy and I think all talked about this, and we just seem to be having difficulty getting the decision made, so, yeah.
And it is one, because a lot of churches don't have one, and there's generally not an issue there. Other cases, if there's not one and if there is one and it doesn't work, I would literally have to go back and ask them how they look at that,
Could
because
you
I'm
do
not
that for
sure.
us? 'Cause
I can, yep.
I would like that answer so that we know we're, so that we know what we have to say. It needs to be done, or we can continue to.
Right.
So that would be-
Where the priority sits, understand? Yep. If it's a code thing, if it's fire code, and the church and fire inspectors do come around, then that's a different matter.
Could you email that to the church office for us?
Sure.
Would that be okay?
In fact, what I'll do is put the message out. What I want to do is create a set of questions and answers in that and fire all that in.
Okay, because I really would like to know the answer to that.
Okay.
And soon, yes, soon would be one, yeah, soon the better. Thank you, Alex. That would be good.
Well, thank you, folks. Appreciate your time and your attention and involvement. And stay tuned. If you've got questions, please feel free. Drop us an email or give us a call.